All right. Alrighty. So hopefully the one person that's in here can let me know in the comments if they can hear me. Let's see. Now, can you hear me? Let's see. So I haven't actually done one of these before. So I kind of anticipated some technology obstacles here. So yeah, if anybody can verify that they hear me, just type yes in the chat box. All right, that's not a good sign. Let's see. Oh, cool. Hey, Austin. All right. What's up, Austin? That's good. Yeah, it seems every time I hop on either a Skype or a Google Meet, something goes wrong in terms of the audio. So, yeah, thank you anyone who's joining in. It's like I said, I haven't done one of these before, but I have one question here in the comments that I can address. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, training, non-training, nutrition related, yeah, just feel free to mention them. I'll get through as many as I can. So, first question from Forehead Ass is, what are 2 preventative measures you would recommend implementing to avoid acute or chronic injury? So this one, this is kind of hopefully not a cop-out answer, but I think the first thing is, I think sometimes people are looking for modalities, what are some things that you can do, drills, whatever, that are going to help. But I think, volume management is a big one. Not feeling like you need to do as much volume as you can recover from, because, what that, where that point is and where you're going to make optimal progress in the long run aren't necessarily the same. And I talked about this on podcasts before, where, we have the research that, shows volume is, positively correlated with hypertrophy. And, there's up to a point anyway. And sometimes, depending on the study, that point can be pretty high. So, but when we look at it from a longevity perspective, especially in natural bodybuilding, it's what's going to keep us in the game is generally going to be the ideal amount of volume. And I think that range of, what's effective and what, kind of our max is wider than people realize. So the first thing I would do is just focus on, managing your volume. If you're making progress, block to block, and things are trending up over time, and you're staying healthy, I think that's a good justification to stay put. So that's kind of the first thing. The other thing is just picking exercises, picking movements that are conducive to your body. For example, don't be married to the idea of back squatting if your goal is hypertrophy and you have really long femurs, poor ankle mobility and a short torso. So picking things that are just going to be less, to borrow a term from Mike Israetel, is less systemically fatiguing. Things where you can, you have a lot of stability, you can generate a lot of output, and be, pain-free is the way we want to go. The other thing, I was thinking about some of the things that I do personally. One thing that's really helped me over the past few years is, with isolation movements, doing them in a manner on a cable machine where the direction of force lines up with the joint. So if I'm doing a tricep extension, maybe doing a crossbody tricep extension where, the cable is parallel with my upper arm. So if you're doing an overhead dumbbell extension, you're up here, the force is going straight down, but you're extending this way, it's going to be it's going to be putting a little bit of additional torque on your elbows in a direction that it's not used to going. So hopefully that's helpful. But that's one thing that I think good exercise selection and setting up the movements, appropriately can go a long way in, keeping you progressing. Who is your favorite amateur athlete that you coach? Well, I've got a couple of you here, so I can't say, but no, everyone that I coach has been awesome. Both Austin on here, Matt. I just read through your update. Matt's looking to compete here in the next year or so. So I think that that'll be exciting. So yeah, everyone that I've been working with is fortunately been a really good fit. So you all are awesome. Do you think that a bro split, hitting a muscle one time a week with lots of volume, like chest day, back day, leg day, shoulder day, arm day, can work well for natural lifters training for hypertrophy? I think it can. I think the obstacle that you kind of run into with that is just the overall amount of volume that's you can benefit from within a session. So if you're somebody who's intermediate to advanced, it may be in your best interest to split it up a little bit, simply because like one way to think of volume is every additional set we do is providing less return, so having a having a bro split is like you can still get similar amounts of volume, but could the return on each of those sets, say you're doing 15 sets in one session versus two, I would argue in the long run that the two is going to be, more beneficial. The other thing I like about more frequent, or at least twice a week, is usually, at least for me, like as I get older and, priorities, the list continues to grow. If I have to like skip a session or if I miss a session, I know if I'm training something twice a week that like it's not going to be long before that session rolls around again. Whereas if you're doing a bro split and you don't want to wait like another full set, go 2 weeks essentially without training a muscle group. So sometimes that, the frequency or the timeline between hitting the same muscle group can get kind of lengthy if you do have like volatility in your schedule. So that from a practical perspective, I think is one reason that it would be worth implementing it a couple times a week. But I also think, with the qualitative aspect is something to certainly consider. But can you make progress? Absolutely. And there's top level natural bodybuilders that are training once a week per body part. So it can definitely be done. Have you ever had a client who wouldn't really respond to training anymore? How would you troubleshoot these cases? That's a really good question. And yes, and sometimes it's less so that they won't respond to training, we need to manage their expectations based off of their genetics and where they're at in their training career. Somebody who's puts on muscle just looking at the weights, like that's going to be pretty easy. Whereas, a quote unquote like hard gainer, somebody who's not, it's a hypo responder to resistance training. Sometimes it's like we need to take the small wins when we get them and know that, block to block progress, like that stuff does add up over time. And I think that's one thing, a message that I continue to try to get across is, progress isn't going to be linear. But if, even if you're making progress, you're seeing an upward trend in numbers every third block, if you kind of compare your average performances, like it's rare for somebody to just not respond at all. And so somebody who is, less genetically blessed for putting on muscle, who's been training for 15 years, it's going to be more a matter of managing expectations. There's one thing, hard gainers, people that sometimes they tend to need a little bit more volume. But I always kind of go through the checklist with volume in terms of like, okay, are they progressing at a rate that's reasonable for them at this stage of their career? If yes, it's like, okay, are they staying healthy? If yes, then it's like, okay, well, what more could we really ask for? And then you kind of go into the practical side, like, okay, is adding volume going to now be restrictive to their, you know, sustainability? Like, if are they limited on time? But what I found is rarely does, and this is my opinion, you'll hear different opinions from other coaches, but rarely do I have to add volume in order to kind of get the needle moving again. Sometimes it's cleaning up exercise execution, getting more out of sets, things like adding pauses, in lengthened positions. Sometimes that can help without really adding significant time to the session. So there's like a qualitative side of the work that is worth addressing and, sort of auditing before considering adding more. All right, Austin, as I set up my heel elevated safety bar squat with weightlifting shoes to compensate for my long femurs. There you go, buddy. So yeah, that's one thing. Like if you're not in a good position to, if you have poor ankle mobility, especially, you have to kind of modify movements to suit you. So a heel elevated squat, kind of artificially, increases dorsiflexion, allows you to squat a bit more upright, increase the moment arm on your quads. So that's definitely not uncommon. And a lot of people too, the flip side I think is true, where people get into the sport, especially powerlifting, and they go out and buy a pair of weightlifting shoes, but it's like they don't necessarily need them, So some people are just fine in flats. They have good ankle mobility. They're built to squat. And so I think they just feel like that's what they're supposed to do. So think of them largely as a tool to help, further bias quads at any given load. But also, if somebody has really strong quads, let's say they have really good ankle mobility, but their quads are just exceptionally strong, then that's, that could be a reason to use squat shoes, even if you aren't using them for mobility reasons. Let's see. Random username. Hi, Brian. I was wondering about whether the DHT increase from creatine shown in the infamous rugby study is something to worry about as far as hair loss. I haven't dug super deep into this research, but it seems the consensus is no, because to my knowledge, that hasn't been replicated. I could be wrong, and if I am, someone let me know. But I think, it's not something I would personally worry about. I find creatine, it's like I tend to unintentionally cycle off of it. It's like I run out and then I forget to order it off Amazon. So it's like 2 weeks go by, a month goes by, and it's like, oh well, now I'll just start back up. So if you're concerned about it, maybe come off every now and then. But it doesn't seem like there's enough research for me personally to, that I'm aware of, that is forcing me to stop, or justify stopping in that regard. On another end, what do you consider the minimum effective dose for hypertrophy? I mean, it's a pretty vague question, and it's going to vary person to person, but from like a physiological perspective, it's the amount of stimulus that's going to tip the scales in favor of protein synthesis exceeding breakdown. And, we know, like, from limb immobilization, if people are like just gravity, being upright and standing like that's going to be a stimulus that's going to increase protein synthesis. Now, it might not increase it above like rates of breakdown, but it's not what I want people to avoid, is like getting into the position where they feel like they need to push volume higher because that's what they've been doing and they feel like they need to build off of that. So if you're making progress, like oftentimes a lot of people come to me that are doing a lot of volume. They're like, okay, this is what I need to progress. But increasing volume just doesn't make much sense on paper. There are outliers that exist, but oftentimes, people assume, okay, if this is what I've been doing, this is what I need to continue to progress. And, I've probably mentioned this before, but, the volume in hypertrophy, it's on that inverted U curve. So like this is the Y and X axis, it's like this, and everything above the X axis can be thought of as effective. That's hypertrophy if hypertrophy is on the Y axis. So Sometimes people will be kind of on the right side of that curve and they just assume like, okay, I need to be doing as much or more, when really pulling back a bit and it will kind of put them more at the in the middle, you know. So I've seen people get better results by doing a little bit less. So it's to be honest, it's one of those questions where I feel like a lot of people, they the best way to think about it is just go in with a reasonable amount of volume for your training age and assess, you know, collect data, see if you're progressing, staying healthy, and if you are, then you know you're above the minimum effective. Okay, so I lost my spot. Okay. John K, I'm on my first serious cut from 18%, currently 12%. Does it really get difficult getting to 8%? What should I expect? Is it just more of the same thing? Just takes longer and stick with it. You know, it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. You know, it kind of depends on where your body likes to hang out. You know, somebody who's like, take Berto, for example, you know, he can naturally stay pretty lean in the off season, like if left to his own, you know, eating habits. I mean, he's changed his, he basically force feeds himself in the off season in many cases. But, you know, there's people that just simply do better at lower body fat percentages and there's less pushback. And then you have people where, you know, getting, you know, into single digit body fat, it's, you know, a significantly greater struggle than it is for somebody else. So, you know, it's all relative to kind of where you normally hang out. And like, if you were like where your appetite is on a regular basis, if you're someone who's like, okay, I need to control, you know, basically I need, you have your foot kind of on the brake all day, you know, to avoid going overboard. Um, you know, you may be somebody then that tends to hang out a little bit higher, and that's just where your body likes to be. And in that case, it probably is going to suck a little bit more to get, you know, into single digit, but it's more tied to like body fat than it is body weight. So, but I mean, I've always said like anybody can get very lean. It's just a matter of like who can kind of outlast and outplan in many cases when it comes to prep. Because a lot of people, you know, bodybuilders are a motivated demographic, and most of them are willing to do whatever it takes to reach their goals. But what I found is in many cases, people simply run out of time, like in prep, when they could have gotten significantly leaner. So planning ahead and just finding a sustainable way to go about it. Like, I'm a big proponent of sustainability, and you know, what may look 100% optimal on paper may lead to, you know, 50% compliance, and in that case it's kind of useless. So find, you know, a rate of loss that's sustainable. Understand that there are going to be days where, you know, deep into a prep, for example, where it's like the best analogy I can use, it's kind of like having cinder blocks on your feet. You know, your body is very crafty in regulating its expenditure when you're, you know, deprived of calories. So it's sort of, what point does your body start to sense that threat personally? So it's going to be different for everyone. Let's see. Super Muscle 88. Can you speak more about how to set up a mesocycle to mesocycle progression? Which variables should we focus on? So, you know, hypertrophy, when it comes to like uh, periodization, sorry, I don't know why that word was evading me, but when it comes to periodization, hypertrophy is, there's not a lot of evidence that it has a significant impact on hypertrophy. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. Like, it would make sense for strength, which it does have an impact, where like strength is not a direct adaptation. You know, it's a byproduct. It's the expression of different adaptations, you know, neurological, you know, hypertrophy, muscle mass, things like that. So you're going to have, like, in order to maximally express strength, like there's, you know, it makes sense that since you're dealing with different adaptations, how structuring your training may make a significant impact on the outcome. Whereas hypertrophy, it's, you know, kind of going back to the minimum effective dose, you know, comment, like how I would qualify that. like it is an adaptation in and of itself. So it's like, as long as we're, pushing things towards, the protein synthesis side of things, and we're performing enough to actually be in a positive, protein balance, in skeletal muscle, then like there's really like not as much evidence for periodization for hypertrophy. Now, that's not to say that it's useless. And, I think when it comes to like the steps I go through mentally when I'm, adjusting someone's, mesocycle, from one to the next. And, um, Matt, it's on here. He just wrapped up his block. And so we're transitioning into the next block. And it's like, okay, what do we need to change here? And in many cases, it's sometimes it's nothing, and, building muscle over time, like there's an element of boredom that can be involved there. And sometimes I feel like I struggled with this early in my coaching career. It's like people are paying me, but I don't have enough justification really to justify changing a bunch of stuff. It's just like, okay, I feel kind of bad giving them the same thing again. And so but I've gotten better with that. And I think, I have no issues if somebody's performing well, just repeating a block. But at the end of the day, like what builds a lot of muscle naturally is just time. And so keeping people, interested, keeping some texture to their routine, is important. Varying rep ranges, if I still like to kind of have these slight like intensification phases with hypertrophy. So like a 8 to 12 range may become 6 to 10 or 5 to 8. And a lot of that is just it's not necessarily that it potentiates downstream hypertrophy. Like the evidence doesn't really seem to support that. But I think from a longevity perspective, it can help in terms of, behaviorally and staying engaged with the movements and, being able to handle some additional weights. Like psychologically, I think it can help to a large degree. And not to say that all, hypertrophy adjustments are based off lifter psychology, but, it kind of goes back to, are you progressing? Are you staying healthy? If so, like, why overhaul, So, but, with progression from mesocycle to mesocycle, I think getting to a point where, you're sort of evaluating, where you're at in different rep ranges, strength wise, sometimes there's an infinite amount of ways to, manage progression. But, really, I tend to, hopefully, the last week of the block is always going to be the most difficult, with fatigue starting to come up. But, sometimes if like for a strength athlete, for example, I might have somebody start a block then 5 pounds heavier than they did the last block and run through the same progression format. So it's kind of just rinse and repeat in many cases, but your starting point is often a little bit higher. Let's see. All right, Austin. Whoops. All right, how would you recommend counting volume for biceps and triceps in reference to movements they're secondary or tertiary to? This is a good question. And this is also one of those questions where like it's sometimes people obsess about this, and like they like to have, these output numbers for specific circumstances, with, them being supporting muscle groups. And with the research, we know that it like a bench press would count as a tricep set, a row would count as a bicep set. So if we're going off like the 10 to 20 set, kind of guidelines in the meta-analytic research, that does tend to include, the secondary movements within it. So if you did 10 sets of bench, it would count as 20 sets of triceps. But in reality, it's like your triceps usually aren't the limiting factor on a bench press. So like whatever fails first is probably receiving the greatest degree of stimulus. So, a tricep extension is probably going to carry, of some sort, will carry a greater stimulus probably than a bench press. But so in a way, like that's sort of where the question comes up, right? Like, well, if an isolation movement is more stimulative than a compound, how can we count them the same? The answer is we don't really know how to best do that. We just know what the research has told us. And to add to that, like research, generally they have to standardize effort in some way if they're comparing different groups. So most groups train to failure. And so then once you introduce RIR, it's like, okay, does that 10 to 20 set thing shift a little bit? And so it's more so the way I kind of like to think of volume is conceptual. Like this is kind of middle of the road, reasonable starting point. And then from there, you have to assess how you're performing. I will say that generally most of my programs, for bodybuilders, even if you count the indirect work, are going to have probably over 20 sets for like biceps and triceps. And that's because of kind of the reason this question is proposed to begin with is the isolation work does tend to be a little bit more taxing. But at the end of the day, you have to manage based off of like emerging information. If you're progressing, everything's feeling good, like it doesn't really matter what you think may be optimal on paper, like stick with it. And that's the other thing about kind of that inverted U curve is there's no guarantees. Like even if you're recovering well and staying healthy, there's no guarantees that unless you have a ton of data on yourself, that increasing volume is going to lead to a better outcome. And what we do know is that increasing volume, regardless of where you're at in that, under that curve, is going to have less return per set than it would earlier on. So earlier in a session, each set is going to carry a greater degree of hypertrophy stimulus. So it's like, okay, is it worth the time investment? Is it worth the potential, decrease? Like, is it worth the potential added stimulus that may be in question to begin with, in terms of like net gain? And, you also have to realize, like I said, that there's diminishing returns there when you do increase volume. Matt, what are your favorite pre and post workout meals? What supplements do you take pre and post workout? Are there any brands you prefer as a natural athlete? For me personally, it varies quite a bit. I like routine, but sometimes like the time of day that I train can vary. Sometimes I'm training late afternoon, sometimes it's, right before dinner. So usually it's like I'm not generally hungry right when I wake up. So I might just have protein, like a shake or something. And then if I do have to train, if I know I have to train earlier that day, then I might have like an intra-workout shake, Gatorade, something like that. And then post-workout is almost always like whatever my next planned meal is. So I do keep it pretty simple. In terms of supplementation, like caffeine and creatine are kind of like the big two that are fairly consistently in place for me. And, I have a pretty high caffeine tolerance, and I try to, it's gotten better, but it's, being strategic and when you take the caffeine, certainly helps. Like if I know I'm going to have to train later in the evening, I might go, have 1 cup of coffee in the morning versus 2. And if I can get away with no caffeine at that point, I will. But I say fortunate here, but it's only because I've abused caffeine. Fortunately, like I can have caffeine later in the day and it not consciously impact my sleep, even though it probably does. Brands. So I think that's an important question. A lot of, especially now, like with powerlifting, like raw powerlifting, there's out of competition drug tests and things like that. So it's even more important to buy from reputable companies. Like I try to stick with brands that are third party tested. Like Ben Escrow is one of my buddies. So like I always like to, kind of plug his brand, Elemental Formulations. Him and Omar Isaf have that company, and they do third party testing on all of that. But there's a lot of companies that are also third party tested. But it's good to know that you're not like, okay, my pre workout wasn't made in somebody's basement, you know. So it's um, that's kind of the rule of thumb is, you know, if you're worried about it, go with a third party tested company, and usually it says it on the label. Um, Jesse Duran Krellin, having a hard time assessing if back squats are tweaking my low back or exhausting it and giving same pump and muscle soreness. I've learned to know it's a sign of progress in my other muscles. All right, let me read this again. Having a hard time assessing. I mean, back squats obviously are going to tax your back extensors, like staying in, you know, even a neutral position is going to take, you know, isometric contraction from your back. Um, but that shouldn't be where, like, it's not a lower back movement, you know, it's like, so if you feel like you're there, even if you feel like they're just really beating you up and affecting your recovery outside of that, I would consider maybe an alternative movement or potentially, you know, increasing heel elevation if needed, to allow yourself to squat maybe a bit more upright. So there's just less shear there. Um, let's see. So pump and muscle soreness, I mean, they're great. Like a pump is great, but they're not great proxies for, you know, effectiveness in my opinion. I don't feel like the research has supported that. Now, what they do tell us, like if you get a pump locally and you are sore, it's like, you know, you've trained that muscle, so it's not like they're useless. But you know, I think, like, take a power lifter for example, or somebody even training in like the 4 to 8 rep range. You know, they might not get really good pumps. They might not get really sore, but it doesn't mean that it's not effective, you know? So I have a hard time recommending people use pump and muscle soreness as a proxy, simply because a lot of that is mediated by the rep range in proximity to failure. And we know that, you know, lower reps, kind of that power building range, that kind of 4 to 8, if you want to call it that, you know, that can still build quite a bit of muscle. And that's sometimes you may not think it otherwise if you were just going off of pump and soreness, because, you know, when you have more metabolic stress, you know, training lighter loads closer to failure, you tend to get a little bit more sore. So, and you obviously tend to get a better pump generally. So I think that can be misleading. But again, I don't think it's worthless. Um, what is your go-to method of progression for isolation lifts? Usually I'll add reps. And this kind of goes for a lot of stuff. Like, I'm a big fan. I like to keep it simple in terms of like just double progression for most movements. Um, so progressing reps before load. So I'll give a rep range. And, you know, once you get to the top end of the rep range, you know, for a given set or across your sets, you can increase load for that set or for all the sets. So there's a couple ways you can go about that. Like, you can kind of start your first set a little bit submaximal. And so, you know, a lot of my athletes are probably familiar. Like, I might program like 4-to-1 RIR. So the initial set is easier, but then you try to replicate reps across each set. So the last set's generally more difficult, and or it gets progressively more difficult. And then with, you know, the progression there, it's like once you hit the top end of the rep range that you would increase load after that. So I find, you know, especially like when we train, there's different adaptive rates, you know, for each kind of adaptation that we're seeking. And, you know, I do find, especially as, you know, with more advanced athletes, like using rep progression can, at least anecdotally, seems to kind of be my weapon of choice before increasing load, rather than increasing load and letting reps come down. Now, there's situations where, you know, I'll still do that, especially if there's like strength, you know, focused goals involved. But, you know, keeping people healthy and kind of just giving their joints a more like graded exposure to the load, and like doing one additional rep is oftentimes going to be a little bit less taxing there than doing, you know, 5 to 10 extra pounds for the same amount of reps. So I tend to, add reps before load for a lot of things, not all, but a lot. And, isolation movements, especially because generally the poundages, that you're using for those are going to be lower in general. And, like a minimal increase, like 2.5 pounds or 5 pounds is like a pretty large relative increase. So if you do go with load progression on something like lateral raises, and I think Eric Helms and I were talking about this on the last podcast, if I recall, but sometimes for something like a lateral raise, like if you find you're increasing reps or increasing weight because you hit the top end of the rep range and then you fall below the low end of the rep range, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Just widen your rep range a bit. Or if you feel your shoulder's a little bit achy using that load, you can just keep climbing in reps. So you can either increase the ceiling of the rep range or you can lower the floor of the rep range. So it's like hypertrophy is pretty flexible in that regard. Let's see. John K, I'm trying to build my traps. Are rack pulls a good exercise, or was it just a flavor of the month? What would you recommend? Thank you for taking time. You're welcome. And I can't remember the last time I programmed rack pulls, to be honest. I think traps, if you've been paying attention, there's debate on what optimizes trap development. I think doing something like an RDL, that's going to kind of stretch them a good bit. But also just doing like upper back rowing movements is also going to target them pretty well. And if you want to throw in a shrug, that's fine. But rack pulls, they're pretty fatiguing. They annoy me because they just wreck equipment. Like at gyms, it's like our gym got some really good bars and people were doing a bunch of rack pulls, bending the bars, and it's like the lift to do if you want to move a bunch of weight, but the range of motion is short. You're not training really anything in a really lengthened position. I mean, maybe your traps, if you're if it's heavy, but you can still accomplish that stimulus without going super heavy like that. So, I would pick an RDL over that any day of the week, and then, just focus on upper back development and, whether it be upper back pull downs, higher, upper back rows, add some shrugs, some RDLs, and you should be covered there. All right, George Glatme. In terms of gap range between maximum effective volume and minimum effective volume in intermediate to advanced physique athletes. Hold on, I scrolled too far. Okay, so in terms of gap between minimum effective volume and minimum. Okay, so you're asking if the gap. So he's asking, like, does the gap between minimum and maximum change, as somebody advances? Yeah, I mean, I think so. The minimum is all over time. The minimum effective dose is going to go up, and that's why progressive overload, is important. You're keeping pace with your adaptations there. But the maximum amount, I think, tends to go up kind of with it. Not necessarily. Well, the minimum is going to go up because of progressive overload, but it's going to take a higher degree of absolute stimulus to reach the same like relative effort. So and I think that's another thing, like minimum effective. We oftentimes quantify volume as number of sets, but to be honest, I don't see in my coaching career, I haven't seen like this linear or even remotely linear increase in number of sets required, going from a novice to an advanced. I think a lot of that has to do with just proficiency in each movement and kind of getting more out of each set. But you keeping pace, like progressive overload within an existing number of sets is still like, that's still above the minimum effective dose. So I think it does climb, and the maximum does climb too, but I think the maximum often climbs more as a result of just like work capacity. than anything. And Eric and I, and then Jacob Skepis with JPS, we wrote a letter to the editor. I think it was 2020 or 2021, I forget. But in response to like Dr. Mike and Jared, they wrote a paper on mesocycle progression. And one point that Eric brought up in the paper was like the maximum recoverable volume. Like that's more of an indicator of like recovery capacity rather than what's like optimal. So I think, as we get progressively better at doing work and, we get in better shape, we tend to be able to tolerate more, but that also doesn't mean that's where like the peak of that curve is, so to speak. So I do think it closes, but it's, I think the low end, like in terms of it closes in terms of stimulus, but number of sets, it's at a slower rate than I think most people realize. And it's definitely not across like one mesocycle. Like I think your MEV, if we're using sets to quantify that, you can roll with a similar amount of sets and continue to progress in most cases. Michael Padovano just stopped by to say hi. How can you be so cool? Have a great day. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, and yeah, he's always been super supportive. Scott, how much research is there supporting some of these so-called optimal exercise selections, like N1 recommendations beyond marketing compared to traditional exercises like bench press, pull down? That's a good question. And I'll preface this by saying, like, I think a lot of what N1, CAS puts out, I feel for them because I think a lot of people misconstrue some of the message that they try to get across. People in the fitness industry like to look at things like in black and white. So, and sometimes, the message, people that kind of run with these recommendations will start to say like, okay, the upper, like for example, pull down, wide grip lat pull down is like useless for lats. And that's not the case. So, and I don't think that's what they're trying to say. I think that's what people think they're trying to say in many cases. But I at the end of the day, like in terms of research, N1 I know does a lot of in-house stuff. CAS would be the one to ask there, but I think with a lot of what they're doing, they'll do like EMG research, but they'll also use things like Moxie, like oxygen desaturation, things like that to, is proxies for, the stimulus within a muscle. So I think it's interesting. And, to be honest, I do think anecdotally, some of the stuff that I've, learned from him, some of the pull down variations, like for lats, for example, that's kind of what everybody immediately thinks about is, they tend to, it's like the opposite resistance profile of a bench. It's hardest in the shortest position. And usually, like if we're doing a wide grip lat pull down, our hands are fixed on the bar. We're never really getting into like a really like lengthened position, with our arm kind of across the body. So, so I think the way, that they kind of reach some of those end ranges and recommend reaching some of those end ranges in terms of lengthened positions, has had a significant impact for me. And I know like Berto is a good example. I think he would tell you the same thing. So I think there's something to it, but at the same time, I think that they're not trying to be a camp that's only advocating specific exercises. I think just people have a hard time like applying context in situations, especially in the fitness industry. So yeah, and people sometimes hear what they want to hear too when it comes to stuff like that. And they like drama. And I'm not Scott. I know Scott well, so like obviously I'm not referring to you, but I don't think that's something that that's not their goal. I'll say that, and I think they're genuinely like intellectually interested in finding the way. And I think Kaz would be the first person to, admit if he changed his mind. So I do have a lot of respect for them. And I think there's a lot, like, for example, like the cable press around, like I just can't, I'm just not a huge fan of that movement. I just feel like I don't have as much stability. Like there's other options I would turn to for that. So, I think a recommendation that I would give is like nobody is the end all be all in terms of sources of information. Take what's helpful and, that you feel is beneficial for you, and other stuff, like, don't feel like you need to just because you've subscribed to something else, another recommendation that they've provided. Adrian, message retracted. Ziegler, can you explain progressive overload as it relates to hypertrophy again? Hypertrophy equals tissue growth, muscle for our purpose, but progressive overload is the effect or cause of hypertrophy. So, yeah, so I've talked about this quite a bit. Obviously I'm happy to explain it again, but it's both. Think of I try to sort of break overload and progressive overload into kind of two different categories. And so overload would be like doing enough to create a stimulus, like a significant enough stimulus to cause muscle growth. And again, kind of going back to earlier, it's like that's the amount of stimulus that's going to tip the scales in favor of positive muscle protein balance, So, and if you think about it that way, the only reason I mentioned that is because it seems like your muscle doesn't know like what it did last time. Like, how much you upregulate protein synthesis isn't going to be predicated on the number you wrote in your logbook, the week before. So, overload is doing enough to grow, basically, or to have a net positive benefit from that session. And a lot of that's also going to be like behavioral, downstream of that. It's going to be mediated by nutrition and things like that. So, progressive overload, though, is something that should be occurring over time if you're doing enough. So if overload's occurring, then with time, progressive overload should be occurring. And so that's more like keeping pace with the adaptations that you're, achieving. And so, progressive overload is adding, it can be thought of a number of ways, but think of it as like you're now performing better in order to keep the stimulus sufficient. So eventually, like progressive overload will need to occur in order for overload to continue to occur, but it's not going to be like a linear thing, like session to session. So hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I explained it a little bit different every single time because I'm trying to add to it a little bit, but it's one of those things that it is sometimes like the chicken or the egg scenario, but ultimately, like think of, and this is where I think like things like the effective reps model, although I think it's slightly flawed, I think it can be helpful. So for anybody that's not familiar, a common way to think about this, and I know Chris Beardsley, who I have a lot of respect for, he talks about like the last 5 reps before failure are stimulative reps. So basically anything from 5 RAR and down is going to be contributing to an increase in hypertrophy. So if you think about it that way, it's like if you train and then you adapt and then your 5 RAR, say that's like your adaptive threshold that you need to reach. If you improve and your max strength for that movement goes up, you need to add reps or load in order to stay within that 5 RIR range. And so that's one way, I think, conceptually, where it's helpful to use that model, where it's like eventually that adaptive threshold, wherever it is for a given movement, I don't think it's 5 reps for every movement, but wherever it is for that movement, you need to keep pace with the rate that you're adapting in order to stay within that adaptive range. Let's see. Super Muscle, thank you. Appreciate your response, of course. George Glatmy, views on muscle damage, its potential benefits or drawbacks to recovery and programming moderate to high frequency programs with moderate to high training volumes. TLDR, thoughts on muscle damage. So I look at muscle damage more as something that should be controlled rather than sought out. And I think most people are probably on the same page there. I'm not saying that it doesn't have, a direct role, small direct role in hypertrophy, but chasing muscle damage, I think, like what we do know is like severe muscle damage limits like central output, like your nervous system. It makes sense from like a protective aspect. It's like if your contractile tissue is ripped to pieces and you're trying to recruit those those fibers, it's like that's kind of that it's not advantageous for you. So motor unit recruitment when muscle damage is significant can be compromised. And if that's the case, then you are compromising the stimulus, at least like conceptually based off of what we know. But I also don't think it's like the boogeyman, like I think it's one of those things that is expected to varying degrees. And I do I include things like intro weeks just for like the repeated bout effect, just to mitigate that, because you don't want to get to a point in week 2 where you've buried yourself in week 1, you're wrecked heading into week 2, and now like your training is compromised simply because of the muscle damage. So it's more something to manage rather than avoid, and it's certainly not something I would seek. Matt, 5 sets under a cluster. I'm not sure what he's referring to there, but yeah, probably because I just programmed him that earlier. So sometimes like cluster sets, like rest pause and cluster, I incorrectly, admittedly, use those a little bit interchangeably. They're different concepts, but when I program clusters, it's like old habits die hard. Like it's more like a rest pause approach. So I might have somebody that's doing a set of 15 to 20, resting 30 seconds. Let's say that set of 15 to 20, like pick a load you think you can get 15 to 20 reps with, close to failure. So they take it up to like a 0 to 1 RIR, rest 15 to 30 seconds, repeat. But sometimes I'll decrease the rep range on that initial set. And so in an effort to kind of compensate for some of that reduction in total volume, especially if those later sets are only a couple reps, then I may add a cluster there. George, you think there is such a thing as latent hypertrophy? Mike Israel talked about this being seen in people post-diet. Seen kind of a rebound of hypertrophy from the past months of training in a deficit. You would have asked me this 2 years ago. I probably would have said no. But there has been some evidence of this in the literature, and mechanistically, I'm not going to pretend I know why. Like when you look at it simply, and this is sort of an incorrect way to look at it, but like protein synthetic data is helpful. It provides insight into like acute, responses to training. But if you think about it as like, okay, when you train, you increase protein synthesis for 48 hours, give or take, then it wouldn't really make sense why latent hypertrophy would exist. But there's also some, evidence that it can. And so that's something, it's an interesting topic that like I'm eager to see kind of unfold. But I do think there is some possibility there. And I think anecdotally, I've noticed it too, where, I might really push myself for a while and then, go on a vacation or take a deload, and, a week or two into the next block, it's like I feel significantly fuller and bigger. And maybe some of this is fullness, but, I feel like I've put on a little bit more, or I should say I just look bigger simply than I did when I ended the block. And so whether or not some of that's like actual like contractile tissue or just fullness or, a reduction in inflammation, it's hard to say. But I do think it wouldn't surprise me if it's possible. And it does seem like there's some evidence to indicate that it is, but I don't know the mechanism behind that. Do you think it's something that could be specific to enhanced lifters, or do you think it's things natural as well? I think it's probably, if it exists, like it's probably both. Any plans to get on stage within the near future? So I really want to compete next year, 2024. Like a big limiting factor for me has been time and just the commitment. Like for anybody that doesn't know, I have 2 kids. My son's 7, my daughter's 4, and so he's in first grade now. So he's in school 5 days a week. She's still going only a few times a week. And then this fall will be 5 times a week. And so it's just much easier to manage when you have more time. Sometimes I find I'm working, kind of in chunks throughout the day, and I don't want to have to do that and, manage a prep. But I think they're at a point where I can, 2024, that's my goal. That is my goal. I guess has anything to the idea of compound lifts causing high androgen response in the body compared to isolation lifts, and therefore being more hypertrophic. I mean, there's no doubt that, compound lifts, higher degrees of volume are going to cause a higher androgen response. But it's also been shown that longitudinally that does not matter. It doesn't mean like acute, hormonal increases do not necessarily equal, or in this case, they appear to not equate to more hypertrophy because of that. Adrian, bodybuilding show. So yeah, next year, hopefully. So Bodyworks Prime, transient fluctuations of testosterone. He's responding I guess, asking about the androgen response. So transient fluctuations of testosterone within the normal range in response to exercise don't influence hypertrophy in the published research. Spot on. And I think that's like, if you look at like personal trainer, even honestly, some of them still have this, but like personal trainer manuals, I forget what organization it was early on that I was studying for, but I remember like there was like this hypertrophy rep range, and in the book they were talking about, using compounds because of the hormonal aspect, using short rest intervals because that'll increase, growth hormone secretion, things like that. And since then it's been like solidly debunked that that's an actual contributor, which is great, honestly, because nobody likes doing super high reps with short rest. Portia McRobbie, how to return to squats after minor hip labral tear, light box squats, and gradually increase range of motion load. Hack squats. This is, I don't want to overstep my lane here. The first thing I would recommend is like get with a qualified PT. But in my experience, I've worked with people that have had hip labral tears, and just various issues where, full depth is causing a large degree of discomfort. And it seems like for a lot of stuff, just graded exposure does tend to be kind of the weapon of choice for a lot of PTs, gradually increasing ROM. Like I have an athlete that is overcoming an adductor strain who, we went from box squats, gradually lowering it and, got to the point where full squats were comfortable. So that could be an option. But I would stick with what's comfortable and, take it gradual, because at the end of the day, it's like we can't progress if we're continuously hurt. And I think it's very easy for people to try to accelerate the timeline a little bit, and really they just end up kind of setting themselves back in many cases. So take it slow, get with a PT, and because everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different, but it does seem like operating kind of within your comfort level and just kind of slowly dialing that knob up a little bit in terms of increasing the range can, in my experiences, has helped. But not necessarily, just with strains and things like that and hip labral tears. It really depends on the severity there. Big Sun. Hey, coach, do you ever take a couple weeks off lifting? How do you decide when to do that? I've been feeling pretty beat up lifting between sport, or pretty beat up recently between sports and lifting. Yeah, I have. Probably more than I advertise, actually. So, this is something like I'm still refining is my, on my own, because, I program for myself, which I feel like I do a pretty good job objectively doing, but It didn't used to be the case, but I've gotten better at it. And, I think oftentimes I'll push a block a little bit further if I know I have like a trip coming up where training might be less convenient or just completely limited. Like I went to Belize with my family and in-laws last year, and I think I went 10 days without training, and I came back and I felt amazing. And so, and within, a few sessions, I mean, I didn't, it felt wrong. Like at the time, it felt like, okay, this is too long, but strength picked right back up. And I think going through some of those periods where it's like you realize the wheels don't fall off is pretty valuable. And I know I've mentioned this before, like when we first had our son, the first 2 weeks, especially, are like a gauntlet with a newborn. And I didn't train, I think, for 2 or maybe even 3 weeks. And if I did, it was like going through the motions, like just something to get out of the house, basically. Um, but for all intents and purposes, like it was lacking an overload stimulus for probably 3 weeks. Um, and I remember like it was hard mentally. And once I did finally reintroduce lifting and I was in a better spot, I felt good. Um, and I ended up PRing on my deadlift like 3 weeks later. So it comes back in a hurry. And it's not, I also don't want that, people to think like that's an excuse just to take time off haphazardly. But when there's situations where it's like you've been pushing it pretty hard and like, okay, well, am I going to say you're going on a trip or to a resort or something? And you're like, okay, do they have a gym? And you look and it's like really crappy equipment, or, maybe you just don't want to train on that trip. Then I think that's fine. And I think most people, once they kind of go through that a time or two, they realize that it's pretty easy to pick back up. But you are kind of making up a little bit of lost ground in some cases, but the rate that comes back is significantly faster than what it took to get it to begin with. So but if you do it too much, it's like you end up like there's an opportunity cost of doing that, right? Like you're not moving forward during those periods of time. Like, okay, you're not moving forward when you're on your trip, you're not moving forward when you're recouping your gains. So it kind of can be thought of in some ways as like 2 lost weeks, but in the grand scheme of things across a whole lifting career, that's nothing. So I try not to stress it. Super Muscle 88, thank you for your time. No problem. I want to ask, how many sets per workout can we perform before we exceed our systemic MRV? I tend to rarely in my program, especially for like compound movements, like more than like 8 to 10 sets for a body part. If it's isolation, sometimes it's a little bit more than that. But I often program below that too. So I think, there's, again, like a lot of people, like these are concepts. These aren't like lines in the sand. And I think that's the big thing that I want to reiterate is, MEV and MRV, like, yes, they're points on a map, but we never know where they're at specifically, physiologically, it's like MEV is where we start growing, where we're building more protein than we're, getting rid of, or turning over. So it's, so yeah, it is a spot on the map, but obviously we're never going to know exactly where that is. And so again, it kind of goes back to pick an educating starting point and assess progress. And then from there, it's like, if you're progressing in those movements, you're not doing too much, like, could you be doing less and making better progress? Potentially. But if you're changing things constantly, then it's hard to tell really what is working and what isn't. I'm a recovering Renaissance periodization trainee, RIR progressing. So yeah, that's one thing that kind of bothered me when Eric, Jacob, and I wrote that letter to the editor about Mike and Jared's thing. Never were we saying like that model doesn't work or that model can't be optimal. It was more like, okay, the rationale of this model is based off of assumptions that aren't supported based on the actual literature in some cases. But that being said, like progressing RIR, like if I had to guess, like their recommendations in their original paper where it's like, okay, add sets, or their example, I should say, not necessarily recommendations, but the whole premise of that seemed to be, if volume is correlated with hypertrophy and load isn't, which on the surface is true. Like volume is, more is better up to a point, but we also know we can grow across, heavy and low, loads. Then why should we focus on, load progression? Why wouldn't we just add volume? But there's never really been research that's compared the two scenarios where you're keeping volume relatively consistent versus like that same average volume, but you start low and end high. So it's more that we just don't have that data. And they're still very viable options. The one thing I think practically that I think, I've heard for a lot of people is, by the time they get to that week, where it's like they're pushing things the most assertively, in terms of volume, sometimes it's like that might not be a good week for them to do that. And so, so I think for people where their schedule's relatively consistent, like it's still a very, I mean, it's not saying it doesn't work. It will work, and they've shown that. It's just, I don't think we can say it's optimal, and I don't think we can say it's, suboptimal either. It's just, I think hypertrophy is just a much more flexible goal than a lot of people realize. Let's see. When doing cardio during contest prep, would it be better to do activities like elliptical or swimming in comparison to Stairmaster or HIIT to limit systemic fatigue? I think so. When it comes to like the topic of like interference of cardio in resistance training, it seems a lot of it is kind of mediated by like the degree of muscle damage that can occur through cardio. Like sprinting, it's like there's a braking element there too. So things like that, like low impact, mostly like concentrically focused, cardio, that's not, very explosive, I think is going to be what I would gravitate towards. And it's not to say that like HIIT isn't effective for fat loss. It definitely is. But at the end of the day, we have to, and this goes for any research, we have to look at what the data is telling us, but then contrast that with, okay, how do we fit this in with, within a full program? This isn't an isolated variable we're talking about. We're not, okay, if HIIT's better for fat loss in one study, and so we decide to do HIIT, but in the process we compromise our ability to recover from resistance training, then muscle retention is not going to be as good. And so I tend to try to separate cardio and resistance training, in the sense like resistance training is there to build muscle. It's not like the goal isn't to burn calories, and then cardio is just helping chip away at expenditure and getting a cardiovascular training effect, which is important from a health perspective. But I'm a big fan of the elliptical, honestly. Like it's low impact, an easy way to kind of get some additional cardio that I find actually helps my performance is doing like 5 to 10 minutes on the elliptical before I train, 5 to 10 minutes after. It's a good warm up, easy cool down. When you're done, like your heart rate's already pretty elevated, so you can kind of sustain that pretty easily at that point. But I tend to gravitate more towards low impact forms of cardio. And Stairmaster, it's not that it's super high impact, but it is pretty exhausting. And so if you have limited time and you need to take a decent chunk of calories with that session, then that might be a better option than walking at like a slow incline. Should I take BCAT? Should I take more volume if my muscles aren't sore the next day or even the same day? I do 6-day push-pull legs and, for example, 18 sets chest a week. I don't think, no. I don't think you should like automatically do more volume because you aren't sore. And that kind of goes back to a previous question, like kind of chasing. I mean, muscle damage and muscle soreness aren't the same thing, but they oftentimes are correlated with each other. But I don't think what I would do more volume if you're doing everything else right and you're not making progress. But if you're not sore and you're progressing the movements, over time, then like that is telling us that the stimulus is effective, and you are getting stronger, and that should trump any of the more subjective factors like soreness and pump. Bodyworks Prime, what's your opinion on application of exercise science and hypertrophy research? Many studies don't include individual data points and focus on mean, but most studies have low and high responders. I think it's, my thoughts are that it's worth knowing that, and not being, sort of married to one range. Like I've worked with people where, we start them on something that seems kind of middle of the road based off of, the evidence, and they end up requiring significantly more. In many cases, oftentimes it's less. And so there are outliers. And so like if the point isn't, like the point I like to reiterate is like be reactionary rather than just proactively change things because of, research. Like if you're doing something that's working, phenomenally, and research comes out and says like, provides, the mean tells us, okay, well, on this movement, like if your biceps are jacked and there's research coming out telling you, train at long muscle lengths, but you rarely do that, but you keep getting jacked biceps, like don't feel like you have to do that. There's still like any progress for a natural athlete that's measurable in the short to moderate term is good, because it does take a lot of time. But I think it's important, the role of research is, it provides models to kind of work within, and, thought models to manage things and kind of know the relationship between different variables. But it might provide like an educated starting point, but from there you have to be reactionary, and that's because there are high and low responders to things. Figus, I've trained with progressing RIR and volume model for around 2 years now, and I feel like it's affecting my longevity. Any tips for getting back into a more basic style of training? I mean, I would try not doing that. I think, doing something that's, keeping volume, let's say you go from, I mean, I don't know the degree of increase that you're talking about here, but, if you're like doubling your volume from week 1 to week 5 or something, then, take that average and just start with that volume, or maybe do an intro week with 2/3 of the volume and then increase, and then just kind of clamp it and keep it static and just progress, reps. Progressing RIR, I think, I mean, like I said, it can certainly work. But I also think there's not many drawbacks to really using like double progression models that are kind of auto-regulated as well. So it's like, for example, if say you're doing a set of 8 to 12 at 4-to-1 RIR, your first sets, say it's 3 sets of 8 to 12, your first set's at a 4 RIR at 12 reps, your second set's at 12 reps at a 3 RIR, and then your third set's 12 at a 2. The next week, if you increase load, you might not have to go to 8 reps. Like you don't have to start at the low end of the rep range. You can just work back, increase your load. You kind of know what load you're tentatively planning to use heading into the session. And then you can go in, work up to about the same RIR as you do normally, and just rinse and repeat. So it can be still auto-regulated in nature without like average RIR, like increasing week to week, or I should say decreasing, like proximity to failure decreasing week to week. But again, like when you take these things and compare them, a lot of the things average out to a similar amount. And I think some of that could just be psychological preference, to be honest. Like if you like kind of starting off easy and just each week just getting a little bit harder, and then you have 1 week that's just, pretty intense. Some people love that. And, like I said, it's not like those people aren't getting progress. But if it's affecting your longevity, then that would be a red flag for me to say, okay, like let's take a step back. Let's maybe not, progress volume across the mesocycle. Let's, kind of average out what I've been doing and maybe just do that each week, or maybe even a little bit less, and kind of keep average RIR relatively consistent on a week-to-week basis. And if you're doing that and you're doing enough volume, like those progressions should still be there for the taking over time. Jennifer R, which modality or which cardio modality between LISS, like treadmill, walks, miss, elliptical, hit will 100% atrophy muscle mass? I mean, that's kind of an absolute, but I mean, and again, this is hard to answer, because are we talking like in isolation? Are we talking in conjunction with a resistance training program? I tend to think, as long as it's not just completely overboard, LISS is the least invasive and HIT can be the most invasive, but it doesn't mean it will 100% atrophy leg muscle mass. Now I've prepped, like I've had the, I've been fortunate in a way that I've prepped a few different ways up to this point. My first prep was very like HIT intensive. And I did feel like it impacted my recovery. At the same time, it's hard to say with certainty if it was just that, because I was also in a more assertive deficit. So, it's tough to say for sure. The next one, it was more like miss. I felt that was fine. And then the last one, really, my last prep, I just tracked steps, and which is like the lowest of lists. And I think that was, I felt like my performance and like muscle retention was probably better then. But at the same time, it's hard to lean on anecdote, because it's not just one variable that changes. It's like my dieting strategy got better over time too. So I was losing at a more appropriate rate. I wasn't losing too aggressively, which that alone obviously can impact the recovery aspect, which is going to impact how much muscle you retain. So I can't say any of them 100% will atrophy leg muscle mass unless you're just like not eating at all. Frederick, good to hear from you, dude. Thank you for taking the time to do this. You're welcome. I hope you're well, man. Frederick was one of my athletes a couple years ago in Germany. Really good natural bodybuilder. Bernardo Amarim, opinion on training splits in high versus low volume. To be honest, kind of a vague question, but training splits, there's not a best training split. Training splits should be thought of just as ways of allocating the volume in a way that's sustainable and allows you to perform your best, on each day. So like if you can maximize your performance significantly better with one split versus another, then that might be a better split. So high versus low volume, kind of touched on that earlier, but it's just completely dependent on the individual. I do think, I'd mentioned like over time, it does seem like people will, sometimes people think they need to like increase sets over time. And I just haven't seen that in practice. And I think a lot of that, sometimes I even see, people like Jeff Albert's great example. Like he's so dialed in with his technique. Like he gets a lot out of each set that he does. But on the surface, people might look at his set volume and be like, he's not doing enough, and clearly like what he's doing is working, So it's, I think once you can be more like precise with your volume, for lack of better words, it's, you may find that your volume requirements, or what you perceive as your volume requirements, might go down. And I know for a fact, like I'm progressing now off of less sets than I did like early in my training career. And it's probably partially because I was doing more than I needed to early on too, but also because I've just felt like I've refine the process a good bit over time. Real Ben Maynard, afternoon, Brian. So I've always wondered, can you auto-regulate volume in a training week? For example, having a baseline volume of say 10 per week, but could work up to 15 if things are going well. Absolutely. So I guess to kind of give you an example of how you could do this, I mean, I think subjective ratings of fatigue heading into a session are pretty useful in themselves. It's like if you're feeling like I'll give volume like set ranges, oftentimes, and some people will, some people like to know exactly what they should be doing, but really it's like if you're under recovered, then doing more is just going to kind of be like picking a scab in a way, so or can be. So I think if you're feeling really fresh and you give yourself a range and you feel like you can go to the higher end of the range, that's fine. But there's also ways to kind of auto-regulate it using autoregulatory tools. So this is, I think, more common, this specific tool, like in powerlifting, but things like fatigue stops, which I think, Mike Tashir, who really kind of brought RPE to the powerlifting side of things. I know, I don't know how they structure it necessarily now, but they might say like work up to a top set. Let's say there's a top set, like triple at an 8, something like that, 3 reps at an 8 RPE on a squat, then back off on load by 5 to 10%. They might assign a specific number there, and then do sets until a set reaches that same RPE as the initial set. So you might do triple at an 8 and then reduce load, and you might, on days where you have a higher volume tolerance, you may get more back off sets before you reach that RPE. And one key to that, though, is like really controlling the rest interval, because you can kind of BS your way through it and just rest longer and do more sets. So, but you will find like your tolerance, locally, in terms of fatigue is going to be different at times. So, but yeah, fatigue stops, that's one kind of way, like, okay, perform sets until you get to this relative difficulty. And that's one way to do it. Fossil Fusion, sorry, or sad I missed most of this, but I hope you're well. I'm doing great. Thank you. Figus, I apologize for the incomplete RP question. I was typing it out and hit send on accident. Yeah, the rewording was definitely, hopefully that got at your question. John Rich, hello, Brian. Do you suspect that many competing naturals utilize Clen, and what are your thoughts about it? No, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be cheaters in every sport. I think a lot of people, it just, for some, it will require them to go through the process and get shredded without that stuff to realize, like, okay, maybe these people weren't full of shit this whole time, So I can say, though, with confidence, a lot of the people that people accuse of, using, anabolics or, things like Clen, I'm very confident that they are not. And, it kind of goes back to earlier, I was talking about naturals and preps. Like, natural athletes can get shredded, and it's usually a matter of kind of giving themselves an ample timeline and just sustaining that feeling for a long enough period to get peeled. And a lot of people aren't willing to do that. And there's some people that are genetically more, predisposed to that being a more efficient process than others. But I think that's like I would have never thought like getting, I felt like I reached, pretty decent conditioning in my last season. And when I first started, I would have never thought that was possible until I actually like experienced it. And so I think that that's part of it too, is just understanding that it is possible once you go through it. BCAT, thank you. I'm progressing in some sort of way from session to session, but I do not want to miss out on any growth with doing everything else right. What things do you mean exactly? Not sure exactly what you're asking there, but I will say, if you're progressing in some sort of way session to session, but you're worried if you're missing out on any growth, like if it's probably something not worth worrying about, because that question's always going to be there. Like I said, like we never know if what we're doing is 100% optimal. There's just no way of knowing. Um, but we look like, okay, is it effective? Is it sustainable? And if you do that over time, you're going to build a pretty damn impressive physique. So I wouldn't worry about like what you're leaving on the table if everything else is going well. Shane Kolodzinski, what are the telltale signs that an athlete may need to decrease volume if starting from a middle ground? I mean, I've touched on this a little bit. I think, like I said, there's no way of knowing specifically if somebody's, sometimes if you have enough data on a person, like you have a good hunch, but I always kind of go through that checklist. One, are they progressing? Two, are they staying healthy? And is this sustainable? And if all of that's, checks out, then rarely do I increase volume. Especially, rates of progress for, this isn't usually a question that novices ask. And not saying you're a novice, but it's the fact that it's more like an intermediate to advanced question. If you're seeing progress, like that's on a regular measurable basis, like that's pretty damn good. If you're seeing progress block to block, worrying about it beyond that, especially if you're staying healthy, I think is like going one way or the others. There's no guarantees either way. You could get worse progress. But decreased volume, it's like if someone is just getting hurt, or their joints are, the connective tissue isn't keeping up with the pace, that their muscle is adapting, pulling back there. And I think that's the big thing. And one thing that I've really started to appreciate over time is the bottleneck for a lot of advanced natural bodybuilders is longevity and, being able to train effectively, into their 40s and 50s. And so, with that being said, like I would rather compromise in the grand scheme of things. I would rather compromise a little bit of stimulus for the sake of longevity, because at the end of the day, that's going to be a better physique because of it. All right, let's see here. Frederick, yeah, you're welcome back anytime, dude. Obviously. Let's see, Bodyworks Prime. Some people seem to progress better off lower volume. What is the lowest weekly sets per muscle you have seen someone drop down to and achieve better progress than their previous higher volumes? I've seen people that, I'm trying to think of like a specific example here. I mean, I've seen people go into the single digits after being in, high teens and get better progress. And I've seen that with myself. And I think a lot of it, kind of goes back to what I was saying a second ago with kind of the bottleneck. For me, like my lower body, like muscularly, I can, like, the window for minimum effective and I guess MRV is pretty wide for me still. So from a muscular perspective, and I think like a nervous system perspective, I can recover from quite a bit, but my joints cannot. And if that's the bottleneck, and reducing volume is going to, even into the single digits, like I might do 3 sets of squats on one day, 3 sets of leg extensions. And then on the next day, or sometimes even like 2 sets of leg extensions. And the next day, maybe squats and lunges, maybe I'm getting 8 to 10 total sets per week. I'll feel better and I'll make better progress because the bottom line outcome will be better because I'm staying healthier. And I know that's like a lot of people like sort of glaze past that and they're like, okay, well, I'm specifically meaning like skeletal muscle mass, but I've also seen people that just simply respond better to lower volumes. And it's always hard to compare apples to apples because oftentimes it's like, I can't say that I respond better to lower volumes, but I can say like I respond to lower volumes in some things, assuming I'm getting a lot out of each set, assuming I'm staying healthy and things like that. So there's a lot of context to attach to, I think, a lot of the questions, that people have. But I've seen, like, I know for me, like from a strength perspective anyway, like I can get stronger training quads with like 5 sets a week. I know I can get better results going a little bit above that and still stay healthy. So I push it a little, but I can't. The recovery curves for these different systems are different, and as you get older, you kind of start to appreciate that. To address the weakest link and kind of have that steer the direction. John Rich, Brian, has Dorian Yates ever been your idol, and have you ever tried his training style before? He's never been my idol. No, I love the old Dorian Yates videos. I think it's hard to watch Dorian Yates and not be excited to train and not be excited about bodybuilding. And so I've always really appreciated that about him. I've always admired that he thought outside the box, and he stuck with what was working for him. And granted, like, you have to keep in mind when he was doing that, like that wasn't the norm, like there was a lot of people, in the 90s training with a ton of volume, and, he was in a kind of on his own island training this way, and people are like, oh, this is suboptimal, but it's like, well, look at the dude, like he's making a tremendous amount of progress training this way, so why would he change anything? So I've always appreciated that. I've tried high intensity approaches where things are taken to failure, work up to one all out set, and occasionally I'll still run blocks that are lower in set volume that have that, but I've never been like a hit disciple or anything like that. All right, I'll do this last one. Figus, I've run into decreased performance in the absence of soreness from more than one workout in a row. Is this normal? Is it likely I'm overreached? So it's possible. Normal, I would say you kind of want to look at expectations in terms of training status. So like if someone's a novice, it's like they should be really, oftentimes, like a true novice is going to be progressing like session to session, so so that would maybe raise some red flags. If you're an intermediate, every couple of weeks, I think you should see something. As an advanced athlete, like I wouldn't even start to think about adjusting things if it was just a couple sessions, or even 3 sessions. And some of that could be due because you have to think like performance, it's a byproduct of the dynamics between your adaptations up to this point and the fatigue that might be masking them, right? So running into decreased performance doesn't necessarily mean the stimulus is inadequate. It could mean that you're overreached. And so if it's been a while since you deloaded, then I would deload and see how you're, where you're at there. And if you're significantly better, a week or two after you come back, then it's like less of a fatigue or less of a stimulus issue and more of a fatigue management issue. So, all right, Bodyworks Prime, you're welcome. All right, I think that's it. No, this was fun. I'll have to do this again. So I hope everybody, I appreciate everybody that tuned in and really good questions. And yeah, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll try to circle back and address any of those. So everybody, yeah, thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you're at in the world, and yeah, see you next time.